Thank you for your testimony. I continue to believe that one of the greatest threats our country faces is the accumulation of debt. We borrow about $1 million a minute. We've given away over $300 billion in foreign aid over the last 10 years. During those 10 years, we've accumulated over $10 trillion in debt. Now, some would say, well, it's only 1% of the budget, it's not a big deal. Actually, if you cut 1% of the budget each year over about a 5-year period, you actually balance your budget within 5 years. So the savings does add up. The other thing I think in thinking about this is that most of us give privately to charities or to our church, and most of us would think it would be absurd to borrow money, go to the bank, borrow money to give to your church. You give out of your surplus or out of your earnings, but you don't give out of borrowed money. And I think it's equally absurd for a country to borrow money from China to send to Pakistan. It sort of defies any common sense. The other argument, though, is whether or not it actually works, whether the money, if you say, well, gosh, it's so valuable and we borrowed this money and we're going further into debt, but it works. But there's quite a bit of evidence that maybe it doesn't work. You know, we've plowed $1 trillion into Iraq, and Iraq has treated their liberation that we granted them with falling into the arms of Iran. You know, you could make the argument they're closer allies with Iran than they are with us. They don't seem to do what we asked them to do with regard to making their army more national and less sectarian. They brought some of the Sunni uprising upon themselves against our wishes. In Egypt, over the last 10 years, we've given them $60 billion. Some estimate as much as half of that was stolen by the Mubarak family. Even liberal institutions such as the New York Times has reported as much as 50 to 70% of foreign aid is stolen. Chairman Corker has mentioned the duplicitous nature of Pakistan, who I think at best can be described as a frenemy, sometimes friend, sometimes enemy, but really duplicitous is probably the best way to put it. We've given them $15 billion over the last 10 years. I don't think I'll convince you, but I think the American people are convinced that we don't have the money to be sending money all around the world when our infrastructure here is falling down, our country is struggling. We just simply don't have the money, and it makes no sense to borrow it. I don't think I'll convince you on any of those points, so I'd rather ask you a specific question about Syria. Do you think it would make any difference if instead of demanding as a precondition Assad leaving, that if the demand were something more like an internationally monitored election within a certain period of time? Is that something that's already been offered up as a possibility? And what is your best guess as to whether Russia or Syria might treat that as more of a possibility of a starting point if it were an election at some sort of predetermined date?
Well, Senator, thanks for your comment on the general issue of aid. I would like to come back to it just for a moment, but let me answer your specific question. Russia and Iran have accepted the idea of an internationally monitored, highest standard election in which even the diaspora can vote. So they are already there. And that is, in fact, part of the laydown in the United Nations Security Council and in the agreement. The problem is that the opposition will not accept the idea of Assad running in an election because they believe that they just don't have confidence it'll be run.
Can I make one quick interjection there? The opposition is going to have to accept something. Assad's not, with Russia's backing, Assad's not going anywhere. He has the upper hand now. So, you know, we're the ones supplying the opposition. We need to tell them they're going to have to accept something.
Well, we'll see. A negotiated settlement of a war requires compromise by everybody. And the opposition has already compromised in significant ways to come to the table. But if you can't end the war with Assad running, is it really worth destroying an entire country and a region over one man who simply thinks his being there is more important than anything else? The question is whether or not, in the course of this process, people will come to their senses and understand, I mean, 4 words could end this war. I will not run. You could immediately move to resolve all of the other issues in a very significant way. So I think, the opposition and everybody believes Assad cannot unite the country. You just can't end the war. I've said this earlier.
Yeah, no, but don't you think the opposition's position is greatly weakened over the last year, and that they really don't have the strength? They're one of 1,500 groups. The opposition we support won't exist without our support, basically. They're being overrun as we speak, in the areas north of Aleppo.
Fought fiercely. The opposition has fought fiercely, and they continue to fight, and they continue to push back against the odds of aircraft bombing them and so forth. And I think that President Putin has to understand what everybody in the region understands, which is that this war can't end. If Russia wants to sit there and fight the jihadis, and that can be obviously their choice. I don't think that's what they want to do.
But I think if you were to think about it, the whole disaster of this war and the mass migration and the killing and all that's gone on, if you could accept the end to the war with an election in a year and Assad might or might not run in a year, that to me is a victory to end the war. I mean, sure, he's a terrible guy. The Middle East full of them, half the countries over there have despots, So, the thing is that I don't have any love lost for him, but there's also 2 million Christians that would choose Assad over the opposition probably. So the thing is that I think if you could negotiate something, that negotiating is giving. If our position and the rest of the world's position is that Assad has to go, you've seen where it's going. It isn't going anywhere.
See, the United States can't impose on people who have lived there under these bombs and starvation and torture. You can't impose on them the notion that they have to live with a guy who did all these things to them. That's the fight. And we don't have the ability, nor should we, impose on them. This has to be a Syrian resolved process.
But they only exist with our support.
I don't think so. I think that they would exist otherwise. They exist in a greater degree. But we didn't create them out of whole cloth. This revolution in Syria began when Assad attacked young kids who went out into the square to demonstrate for jobs and for a future. And when their parents went out, he attacked them. And that was the beginning of this. And everybody knows it. So we are where we are, and we have to try and find it. Let me come back to just the point you made. We wouldn't disagree on everything you said, because there are places where money has been stolen. There are places where it hasn't been well spent. And our job is obviously always to find out why that's happened and to prevent it from ever happening again. But all in all, if you look at the vast majority of countries that we are engaged with and the nature of the world today, Senator, I just have to tell you that if we weren't doing the development work we're doing, if we weren't helping kids to get educated, if we weren't providing some support for the development of healthcare capacity, apart from the humanitarian notion of that, there is enormous developmental return on that investment. And for the United States, I'm convinced more than ever. I mean, I've seen this now for the 3 years plus I've been secretary. It makes a difference, huge difference to the standards of behavior, to the values that those people adopt, to the willingness of countries to join together, to fight Ebola, to deal with AIDS, to fight back.
But I guess you could also make the argument that our support for someone like Mubarak leads to a reaction of anti-Americanism in Egypt.
There have always been.
When they see tear gas shells made in Pennsylvania that we buy, that he suppresses his crowds with, you can see that the reaction isn't always a pleasant one for America.
That's correct. And there have always been imbalances and difficulties in some of the choices that we have made. I don't disagree with you about Iraq. There are a lot of problems in Iraq. But right now, we have a challenge, which is to try to save Iraq and help Iraq to save itself from Daesh. And it's in everybody's interest. Every country in the region wants to destroy Daesh. So we need to do that. I think there are a lot of ways. We are still the richest country in the world. We still have the strongest economy in the world, and we will for some years to come. And hopefully forever, but certainly as we see a rising China, there's a time when automatically, by virtue of size and people, its economy will be larger. Whether it's stronger is a different question. But I would say to you that that we have a huge imperative here to remain deeply engaged, because if we don't, there are too many young people out there, too many countries with a population under the age of 30 to 35, where you have 60 and 70% of the country under that age. And if they don't get educated, and if they don't get job opportunities in this world in which everybody's connected and knows what everybody has and doesn't have, then I fear the evil that will fill their heads and the way in which they could get co-opted into enterprises and efforts that are very, very dangerous for all of us. And so we all have a responsibility here to see that and to try to do something about it, because that is a national security threat to the United States of America, as well as all of our friends and allies.
Senator Murphy, is there a timer on your side of the?